Hello and welcome to this lesson about growth rate. As many of you are probably familiar, companies and businesses seek to grow. They seek to grow their sales and revenues. But beyond a point, any growth in sales and revenues requires a growth in assets. Companies must invest in additional assets. And when they do so, they need financing. And this financing usually comes from shareholders and lenders. The internal growth rate of a company is what can be sustained by using only the shareholders' funds. Companies and businesses make profits and plow back a portion of these profits as retained earnings, which can finance growth. But if companies want to grow beyond this internal growth rate, they need to borrow. And this is called the sustainable growth rate. The sustainable growth rate is what can be achieved by borrowing without increasing the debt to equity ratio. In this lesson, we focus on the idea of growth rate. You will learn how to compute internal and sustainable growth rates. You'll also learn how to apply these concepts in analyzing how companies plan for and finance their growth targets. Most of you are familiar with the idea that companies and businesses seek to grow. But what does that actually mean? Well, when you talk about top line growth, it's basically the growth in sales. But growth in sales beyond a point requires growth in assets. And if we need to grow the assets, the company needs financing, and the choice is then between debt and equity. So basically, the equation is if you want more assets, you must either have more debt or more equity. The way it goes is equity financing can be done through paid up capital or retained earnings, and most companies prefer to tap in on their retained earnings. But if the retained earnings are not enough, then the company will borrow. So, in other words, issuing new shares or raising money through paid up capital is the last option that companies would consider. A quick word on return on assets because that's important for what we are going to discuss going forward. So, if you think of assets as being financed by equity and debt, then return on assets is return on the total capital, which is equity and debt. So, in this lesson, we will use net income as a measure of return to compute ROA, though technically one should be using the earning before interest and tax, adjusted for tax, as a measure of return. So, what exactly is internal growth rate? It's the maximum growth rate a firm can achieve without external financing of any kind. External financing refers to both debt and equity financing. Or, in other words, how much can be financed, how much of the growth can be financed through purely retained earnings. The formula for internal growth rate is ROA times B, where B is the retention ratio, divided by 1 minus ROA into B. So if you see this illustration, you can see how the internal growth rate is computed at 9.65%. The interesting point in this illustration is that the retention ratio is determined by the dividend payout. So when the company earns $66 as net income and it chooses to pay out $22 as dividends, then the retention is $44 or approximately two-thirds of the net income. So more the dividend payout, less will be the retention, and that will affect the internal growth rate adversely. A related concept is sustainable growth rate. This is the maximum growth rate a firm can achieve without external equity financing while maintaining a constant debt equity ratio. So note here that we make a distinction between external equity financing, which is issue of new shares, and internal equity financing, which is the use of retained earnings. And sustainable growth rate is one where a constant debt equity ratio is maintained, or in other words, the company can borrow but not alter its debt to equity ratio. The formula for sustainable growth rate goes like this: ROE times B divide by 1 minus ROE into B, where B again is the retention ratio. So as with the internal growth rate, the sustainable growth rate is also affected by the retention ratio. Less the retention ratio, less will be the sustainable growth rate. To show you the impact of ROA and retention rate on growth rate. So let's say a company started with a capital of $100, all provided by shareholders. If this company earns a 10% ROA, then it'll have $10 as profit, and the company has a policy of paying out 25% of its profits as dividends. So this is called the dividend payout ratio, or the dividend payout policy. And so because of this, the company will get to retain $7.5 or 75%. So if dividend payout is 25%, the retention is 75%. The two together will be 100%. So at the end of the first period, the equity would have gone up to 107.5, the initial capital of 100 plus the retained profit of 7.5. And that represents a 7.5% growth rate in the owner's equity. So you can run through the next period following the same kind of logic, and you will find that the company has again grown by 7.5% in the second period. Now, what is interesting to see here is that if the ROA is not 10%, if it is, say, 8%, then the growth rate drops to 6%. So, the owners of the company who may aspire for a growth rate of 7.5 or maybe even more, they would now find the going a bit difficult, because when the ROA drops, the amount that is retained also goes down. And so what can be internally financed is now limited by the amount of retained profits. So you will, of course, recognize that we are now talking about the internal growth rate. That means the growth that can be sustained by using only the retained earnings, right? So if the ROA goes down, the company has two choices. Either it can reduce the dividend payout and increase its retained profits and try to sustain the growth, or it may try to maintain the dividend payout. That is, it'll say that 25% of my profit will be paid out as dividend, and then look for financing from the outside. And this is one of the situations in which a company can come borrowing to a bank saying that, look, I want to grow, but my internal financing is not enough, and so I would like to borrow.